Drill The Forging of an Outcast, June 22nd, 1941. The first light of dawn barely crested the horizon over the dense birch forests near Ryazan, Lithuania, as the rumble of engines shattered the pre-dawn stillness. You can almost feel the ground trembling beneath your boots, the air thick with the scent of pine resin and diesel fumes. In the distance, the staccato bursts of artillery fire echo like thunder rolling in from the east, while closer by, the crackle of field radios spits urgent commands in German. Private Ivan Petrovich huddled in the shadow of a massive silhouette, his breath fogging in the chill morning air. He was just 20, conscripted from a Siberian village, his hands raw from gripping the cold steel of his Mosin Nagant rifle. Around him, the 3rd Mechanized Corps of the Red Army stirred to life, but all eyes, wary, disbelieving, were fixed on the behemoth before them. It was the KV-1, a hulking monster of Soviet engineering, weighing in at nearly 45 tons, its sloped armor plates gleaming dully under a fresh coat of dark green paint. Designed by the brilliant minds at the Leningrad Kirov factory under the watchful eye of Commissar Joseph Stalin's 5-year plans, this tank was the brainchild of engineers like Joseph Kotin, who had poured years into creating a fortress on tracks. Armed with a 76 2mm F-34 cannon that could punch through any known German armor at a kilometer and flanked by 2 DT machine guns, the KV-1 was meant to be the unbreakable shield of the motherland. But whispers among the crews called it cursed, a lumbering giant too heavy for the rickety bridges of the western frontier, too fuel-thirsty for the strained supply lines. High Command had dismissed prototypes like it during trials, labeling them impractical relics when lighter T-34s zipped across the steppes with ease. Too heavy, the orders had read from Moscow, unsuitable for rapid deployment. Yet here it was, assigned to Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets's 1st Tank Division, a last-minute addition to the defensive line as intelligence buzzed with rumors of an impending storm from the Reich. Kolomiets, a stern veteran of the winter war against the Finns, paced the muddy embankment, his greatcoat flapping in the wind that carried the faint whine of Stuka dive bombers scouting the horizon. He was a bear of a man, his face scarred from shrapnel at Suomussalmi, and he trusted machines like he trusted his own heartbeat, implicitly, until they failed. "Petrovich!" he barked, his voice cutting through the low growl of the KV-1's V2 diesel engine, idling at half power. "Secure that hatch. If the fascists come, this iron beast will be our hammer." The loader, Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov, a burly Ukrainian with calloused hands from factory work in Kharkov, nodded grimly from the turret. He knew the KV-1's reputation. In tests, it had shrugged off 37mm PaK anti-tank rounds like rain on a roof, its 75mm frontal armor impenetrable. But the weight, God, the weight. Bridges buckled under it during maneuvers, and the transmission groaned like a dying ox under the strain. Still, Kuznetsov believed. "She'll hold, Comrade Colonel," he muttered, slamming the heavy breech shut on a fresh shell. Inside the cramped hull, the air was stifling, laced with the metallic tang of lubricant and the sweat of 5 men packed like sardines: driver, gunner, radio operator, loader, and commander. As the sun edged higher, painting the sky in streaks of orange and grey, the first waves of the German onslaught materialized. Operation Barbarossa had begun, Hitler's Panzergruppe 4 under General Erich Höppner slicing through the Soviet border like a hot knife. From the tree line, the growl of Panzer IIIs and IVs grew louder, their 50mm guns probing the mist. Ivan Petrovich's heart pounded as he spotted the lead elements, black crosses on grey hulls, trundling forward with infantry in half-tracks, the Wehrmacht's 6th Panzer Division confident in their blitzkrieg doctrine. Explosions erupted nearby. A T-26 light tank from the Soviet line brewed up in a fireball, its crew spilling out only to be cut down by MG-34 fire. the air filled with the acrid smoke of burning fuel and the screams of the wounded. Kolomiets grabbed the radio handset, his voice steady amid the chaos. "All units, hold the line. KV-1, advance to Sector Bravo. Show them the steel of the Rodina." The KV-1 lurched forward, its wide tracks chewing through the soft earth, each revolution a thunderous churn that sent vibrations up Ivan's spine as he flanked the tank on foot, part of the infantry screen. You imagine the tension coiling in your gut, the way the world narrows to the barrel of your rifle and the shadow of that colossal machine. The driver, Private Alexei Morozov, wrestled the controls, the beast's 600-horsepower engine roaring to full life. But even it strained against the weight. Mud sucked at the tracks, and for a heart-stopping moment it bogged down near a stream, the crew cursing as German spotters called in mortars. Shells whistled overhead, one slamming into the earth 20 meters away, showering them with dirt. "Keep moving!" Kolomiets yelled from the cupola, his binoculars scanning the advancing panzers. The KV-1's gunner, Corporal Dmitry Ivanov, swiveled the turret with a hydraulic whine, sighting the lead Panzer IV at 800 meters. "Target acquired," he breathed, his finger hovering over the pedal. The first shot boomed like Judgment Day, the F-34 recoiling with a flash that lit the interior orange. The shell streaked across the field, slamming into the German tank's turret ring. A plume of fire and smoke erupted, direct hit. The Panzer IV shuddered, its crew bailing out in panic as secondary explosions ripped through its ammunition. Cheers rose from the Soviet line, but it was short-lived. More panzers crested the ridge, their 75mm KWK-37 guns barking in response. Rounds pinged off the KV-1's sloped glacis, ricocheting harmlessly into the trees, the armor holding as promised. Kuznetsov fed another shell home, sweat dripping from his brow. "Reload!" The tank pressed on, crushing a fallen birch under its tracks, its machine guns chattering to suppress the infantry swarming behind the German advance. But as the KV-1 pushed deeper into the fray, a low bridge loomed ahead, the very kind that had doomed its sisters in trials. Kolomiets hesitated, the weight of command pressing heavier than the tank itself. German anti-tank guns were unlimbering in the distance, their crews zeroing in. Even Petrovich, running alongside, glanced up at the beast, wondering if this outcast would finally prove its worth, or drag them all into the mud. The radio crackled with frantic reports, enemy breakthroughs on the flanks, the border crumbling. In that suspended moment, with shells falling like rain, the fate of Raisnin hung on the gamble of one dismissed giant. If you're enjoying this tale of forgotten heroes and iron resolve, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the battles that shape the world. And Berlin, the weight of defiance. The KV-1 ground to a halt at the edge of the narrow bridge, spanning the shallow Rasina River, its tracks hovering like a predator's paws over the weathered wooden planks. June 22nd, 1941, and the morning had turned into a cauldron of fire and fury near Raisnin. You can hear the splintering creak of timber under the tank's idling weight, the river below murmuring indifferently as bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets leaned out of the commander's cupola, his gloved hand gripping the edge, eyes narrowing against the smoke drifting from the burning Panzer IV they'd just claimed. The bridge was a relic from the Tsarist era, barely wide enough for a cart, let alone 45 tons of rolling fortress. Intelligence reports had warned of such vulnerabilities. Soviet engineers had mapped them, but the chaos of mobilization left no time for reinforcements. "Morozov," Kolomiets growled into the intercom, his voice a low rumble over the din of distant explosions. "Ease her forward. Test it." Private Alexei Morozov, the driver, wiped sweat from his brow with a grease-streaked forearm, his face illuminated by the glow of the instrument panel. The hull was a sweatbox, the air heavy with the ozone scent of overheated electrics and the faint acrid bite of cordite from the earlier shot. He nudged the throttles, the V2 diesel engine coughing to life with a throaty bellow that vibrated through every rivet. The KV-1 inched onto the bridge, the first set of tracks biting into the planking with a groan that echoed like breaking bones. Ivan Petrovich, still shadowing the tank with his platoon, froze mid-stride, his Mosin Nagant slung low. The ground seemed to tilt under him, the infantry's boots slipping on the muddy bank as they watched. "It's holding." Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov called from the loader's position, his massive frame braced against the recoil mechanism, but doubt laced his words. The bridge sagged visibly, water splashing up through cracks as the weight distributed unevenly. From the far bank, the German advance pressed on. The 6th Panzer Division's reconnaissance elements, Sund KFZ, 221 half-tracks buzzing like wasps, flanked the river, their 20mm autocannons chattering sporadically. A burst of fire stitched the earth near Petrovich's feet, forcing him to dive behind a shattered birch stump. The air filled with the sharp tang of cordite and the wet earth smell of freshly turned soil from mortar impacts. Kolomiet scanned the opposite shore through his binoculars. Pak-36 anti-tank guns, those squat 37mm relics, derisively called door-knockers by the Soviets, were being manhandled into position by Wehrmacht crews. Their gunners, helmets low, cranked elevation wheels with frantic precision, zeroing in on the stalled behemoth. "Gunner, traverse left, target the pack at 200 meters, Kolomiets ordered, his tone clipped, betraying none of the knot twisting in his gut. Corporal Dmitry Ivanov, eyes glued to the telescopic sight, swung the turret with a mechanical whine, the F-34 cannon's barrel dipping like a finger of fate. The shot cracked out, a thunderclap that rattled Ivan's teeth even from outside. The high-explosive round arced low, slamming into the German gun position in a fountain of splintered wood and twisted metal. Screams cut through the roar, two gunners flung backward, their uniforms aflame. The Pak-36 erupted in secondary blasts, its ammunition cooking off in rapid pops. "Direct!" Ivanov whooped, but there was no time for celebration. The bridge buckled further under the KV-1, a sharp crack splitting the air as a central beam gave way. Morozov jammed the throttles wide, the tracks clawing forward in a desperate surge. Splinters flew, the river foaming white below, but momentum carried them, barely. The tank lurched onto solid ground with a final shuddering thud, mud and water cascading from its underbelly. Cheers erupted from the Soviet infantry, ragged and fierce, as Petrovich scrambled up the bank, his platoon laying down, suppressing fire with PPSH-41 submachine guns. But the Germans weren't done. Emboldened by the stalled advance, a platoon of Panzergrenadiers in their Feldgrau tunics surged from the tree line. Sturmgewehr prototypes, early STG-44s, smuggled from experimental batches, barking in short bursts. They aimed to envelop the KV-1, using the river as a natural barrier. Kolomiets dropped back into the turret, sealing the hatch with a clang that echoed like a vow. "Coaxial, sweep the bank," he commanded. The DT machine gun nested beside the main cannon spat lead, traces arcing in fiery lines that mowed down the lead assault wave. Bodies tumbled into the underbrush, the metallic chatter mingling with the guttural cries of "Vorwärts" from their officers. Kuznetsov wrestled another armor-piercing round into the breach, his muscles straining against the 6 5-kilogram shell. "Loaded, sir!" The radio operator, young Private Nikolai Sidorov, fumbled with the 71 TK3 set, its vacuum tubes humming as he relayed. "This is Heavy 1 to command. Bridge crossed. Engaging infantry. Request artillery support on grid Echo 5. You feel the claustrophobia closing in, the way the world outside becomes a blur through the periscopes. Every shadow a threat." The KV-1 pivoted, its weight shifting like an earthquake, crushing an abandoned German motorcycle under its tracks with a sickening crunch. Ivanov fired again, the cannon booming into a cluster of half-tracks. One Sin KFZ 251 flipped end over end, its canvas sides shredding as fuel ignited in a whoosh of orange flame. The explosion lit the morning haze, casting long shadows that danced across the KV-1's pitted armor. But the tank's mass betrayed it here too. Turning in the soft soil was agonizingly slow, the transmission whining in protest. A lucky shot from a surviving Pak-36 glanced off the side, denting the 70mm plating, but not penetrating. Shrapnel pinged inside like hail on tin, drawing a curse from Morozov as a fragment nicked his cheek. Kolomiets gripped the overhead rail, his mind racing through the Blitzkrieg's playbook. Höppner's panzers were probing for weak points, using speed to outflank the lumbering Soviet defenses. The KV-1, for all its might, was a sitting duck without mobility. Push to the ridge, flank their main force, he decided, overriding the engineer's warnings buzzing in his ear. The tank surged forward again, bulldozing through a hedgerow of barbed wire and felled trees that the Germans had hastily erected. Petrovich's platoon followed, leaping over obstacles. Their bayonets fixed for close quarters. The air thickened with the roar of approaching Ju-87 Stukas, their Jericho sirens wailing like banshees as they dove on Soviet positions to the rear. Bombs walked the earth in geysers of dirt, one nearly overturning a trailing T-34. As the KV-1 crested a low rise, the full scope of the enemy position unfolded. A makeshift strongpoint with two more panzers dug in, supported by 88mm flak guns repurposed for ground support. The anti-aircraft behemoths, those feared 88s, swiveled with hydraulic grace, their crews shouting coordinates. The first ranging shot whistled past, gouging a crater that showered the tank in rocky debris. Inside, the crew braced, Kuznetsov muttering prayers to forgotten saints, Ivanov recalibrating on the fly, Kolomiets' face hardened. This was the moment the dismissed giant either redeemed itself or became a tomb. All or nothing, he whispered, as the F-34 thundered once more, the battle teetering on the edge of the KV-1's unyielding resolve. But with Stuka shadows circling and reinforcements rumbling from the east, the outcast's trial had only just begun. Thunder on the ridge. The KV-1's F-34 cannon belched fire again, the recoil slamming through the turret like a sledgehammer to the chest. June 22nd, 1941, and the ridge overlooking the Rasina River Valley had become a slaughter pen, the air vibrating with the aftershock of that first defiant shot. You can taste the bitterness of gunsmoke on your tongue, feel the heat radiating from the breach as Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov wrestles the spent casing out, his arms burning from the effort. The round had struck true, carving a ragged hole through the glacis of a dug-in Panzer IV OSFD, its 50mm KBK-39 gun falling silent in a gout of flame. The German crew didn't stand a chance. Hatches flew open too late, silhouettes scrambling before machine gun bursts from the KV-1's DT cut them down. Black smoke billowed upward, mingling with the low clouds that hung over Raisnan like a shroud, while the echo of the blast rolled across the valley, momentarily stilling the distant wail of Stuka sirens. Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets didn't allow the victory to linger. "Traverse right. Next target, the 2nd Panzer at 300 meters," he snapped, his voice steady over the intercom's hiss, though his knuckles whitened on the commander's periscope handles. Inside the hull, the crew moved like a single organism, sweat-slicked and focused. Corporal Dmitry Ivanov, the gunner, peered through the PTK telescopic sight, his world reduced to the crosshairs dancing on the enemy tank's turret. The Panzer was hull down behind an earthen berm, its long barrel probing for the Soviet giant, supported by a nest of MG-34 machine guns that chattered from concealed foxholes. Private Alexei Morozov gunned the engine, the V-2's 600 horsepower straining to pivot the 45-ton behemoth without bogging in the churned mud. Tracks ground against rocks, sending jolts up through the floor plates that rattled Private Nikolai Sidorov's radio set. its dials flickering as he broadcasted urgent pleas for support. Heavy 1 to battalion, engaging strongpoint, coordinates Delta 7, flak guns active. Need counter-battery fire now. Outside, Private Ivan Petrovich and his platoon hugged the ridge's flank, their PPSH-41s barking in short bursts to pin down the German infantry. Bullets zipped past like vengeful wasps, one grazing Petrovich's helmet with a metallic ping that left his ear ringing. The ground was a nightmare of shell craters and twisted wreckage. A burned-out BT-7 from an earlier Soviet counterattack lay overturned nearby, its tracks splayed like broken limbs. The scent of scorched rubber and oily fire clawed at his nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of blood from a comrade hit in the leg, now bandaged hastily behind a boulder. "Keep them off the tank," Petrovich yelled, his voice hoarse, as he lobbed a grenade into a machine gun nest. The explosion hurled dirt and screams skyward, buying the KV-1 precious seconds. Ivanov's shot rang out, the high-explosive shell arcing low to detonate against the Panzerwehr's flank. The impact was visceral, a flash of yellow, then the turret lifting slightly as internal ammunition cooked off in a chain of pops and bangs. The tank became a pyre, flames licking at its vision slits, forcing the surviving grenadiers to scatter. But the real threat loomed larger. The 80mm Flak 36 guns, those dual-purpose monsters from the Luftwaffe's ground batteries, now repurposed for anti-tank work. Their crews, efficient in their grey uniforms, fed 80mm rounds into the breaches with practiced speed, the guns' long barrels elevating with a hydraulic whine. The first shot came without warning, a supersonic crack that passed overhead, slamming into the ridge behind the KV-1 and showering the crew with rocky shrapnel through a vision slit. Inside, Morozov flinched, a fragment scoring his arm. But Kolomiets barked, "Steady! Angle the hull! Present the thickest armor!" The KV-1 rocked as Morozov threw it into a lumbering turn, the sloped 75mm frontal plate tilting to deflect the inevitable barrage. You sense the impossibility of it, the way time stretches, each heartbeat sinking with the engine's rumble as the next 88mm round whistles in. It struck the mantlet with a deafening clang, the kinetic force shuddering the entire vehicle, like a gong struck by a giant. Armor held, but the shockwave buckled a hatch seal, letting in a blast of hot air and dust that blinded Ivanov momentarily. "I'm hit! Eyes!" he gasped, blinking furiously as Kuznetsov slapped a rag over his face. Kolomiets seized the gunner's controls himself, his scarred hands steady on the traverse wheel. "I've got it! Load AP!" The loader complied, slamming a tungsten cord round home, the clang of the breech like a promise of retribution. From the turret, Kolomiets sighted the nearer flak gun, its crew frozen in the act of reloading, their spotter waving frantically with a flare pistol. The F-34 roared, the armor-piercing shell punching through the gun shield at 500 meters, turning the 80mm into a twisted sculpture of metal and fire. The breach exploded backward, engulfing the gunners in a hellish bloom. 3 men vaporized in an instant, the barrel drooping like a broken neck. The second 88mm fired wildly in response, its round carving a furrow in the earth that nearly flipped the KV-1. Morozov corrected with a curse, the tracks digging deep furrows as he backed the tank off the crest, using the slope for cover. Petrovich's platoon exploited the chaos, charging forward with bayonets fixed, overrunning the remaining foxholes. A German lieutenant, pistol raised, went down under a hail of submachine gun fire, his body crumpling into the mud. But the strong point wasn't broken yet. Intelligence had underestimated. Scouts now reported a full company of the 6th Panzer's engineers fortifying the position, with 2 more Panzer IIIs rumbling up from the rear, their 50mm guns joining the fray. Mortars from hidden positions began walking fire toward the ridge, 81mm shells bursting in staccato rhythm, forcing Petrovich to ground as shrapnel whined. The KV-1, battered but unbreached, pressed on, its machine guns sweeping the approaches. Kuznetsov fired the coaxial DT in bursts, tracers stitching through a cluster of stewing KFZ 222 armored cars that tried to flank them. One vehicle erupted, its autocannon silenced, wheels spinning uselessly as it burned. Kolomiets wiped blood from a cut on his forehead, his own from the earlier jolt, and keyed the radio. "Command, this is Kolomiets. Strong point reduced by half. 2 panzers, 1 flak down, but they're digging in. Request air support or reinforcements." Static crackled back, the line jammed with desperate calls from crumbling sectors. The colonel's mind flashed to the KV-1's dismissal in trials. Too heavy, too slow. Yet here it stood, a defiant anvil against the Blitzkrieg's hammer, having crushed 3 enemy positions already in this brutal morning. Morozov coaxed the engine forward again, the tank grinding over the wreckage of the 1st Panzer, crushing its turret flat with a groan of tortured steel. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the mist and revealing more of the German lines snaking toward Reisnen, the KV-1 advanced into the valley's moor. Stukas dove once more, their bombs missing the mark but shaking the earth, while fresh waves of infantry probed the flanks. Petrovich, reloading his PPSH with trembling hands, glanced at the behemoth, its armor scarred, paint chipped, but unbroken. The outcast was proving its worth, one shattered position at a time, but the cost mounted. With enemy reinforcements cresting the far hill, the tank's next push would demand everything: steel, blood, and the fragile thread of Soviet resolve holding against the tide. The KV-1 churned forward into the Rasina Valley's narrowing throat, its tracks pulverizing the sodden earth into a wake of mud and crushed wildflowers. June 22, 1941, midday now, and the sun beat down mercilessly through thinning clouds, turning the battlefield into a steaming haze of smoke and sweat. You can smell the charred insulation from the earlier near miss, taste the grit of dust sifting through the KV-1's vents, as Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets peers through the commander's periscope, mapping the next choke point. The valley floor was a kill zone, pockmarked by craters from Soviet 76mm field guns that had fired blindly earlier, their crews now overrun or in retreat. German positions dotted the slopes like malignant growths, machine gun bunkers of logs and sandbags, anti-tank ditches half filled with barbed wire, and clusters of infantry hunkered behind felled pines. "Flank left. Scout reports a nest at grid Charlie 9, Kolomiets ordered, his voice cutting through the engine's persistent growl. Private Alexei Morozov nodded, easing the throttles to nudge the behemoth sideways, the 45-ton frame tilting alarmingly on the uneven terrain. The transmission whined in protest, gears grinding like teeth on bone, a reminder of why the KV-1 had been shelved. Its weight turned every maneuver into a battle of wills. Inside, Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov wiped his hands on his oil-stained coveralls, eyeing the ready rack of shells, a mix of armor-piercing BR-350A and high-explosive OF-350, each one a promise of destruction. Corporal Dmitry Ivanov, his eyes still stinging from the dust, adjusted the gunner's seat, the hydraulic fluid leaking slightly from the earlier jolt. Private Nikolai Sidorov hunched over the radio, twisting dials amid bursts of static, catching fragments of the broader collapse. Panzergruppe advancing on Kaunas. Third Corps encircled. From the hull's side ports, the world outside blurred into threats. Private Ivan Petrovich, leading his platoon in a staggered line behind the tank, scanned the tree line with his binoculars. The Germans of the 6th Panzer Division had adapted quickly. Their engineers, those relentless Sappenmeister, fortifying ad hoc positions with captured Soviet obstacles. The 4th enemy nest materialized first, a reinforced pillbox, its concrete facade camouflaged with branches, mounting a twin MG-34 that spat fire in disciplined bursts. Bullets ricocheted off the KV-1's tracks with high-pitched zings, forcing Petrovich to dive into a shallow ditch. his PPSH-41 chattering back futilely. "Tank! Suppress that bunker!" he shouted over the din, though the crew couldn't hear him. Kolomiets spotted it too, the pillbox squatting like a toad at the valley's bend. "Gunner, he on the slit, 200 meters!" Ivanov's finger depressed the pedal, the F-34 cannon traversing with a servo-assisted groan. The shell lanced out, detonating against the embrasure in a bloom of shattered concrete and splintered wood. The MG-34 fell silent, its crew shredded inside, but the position wasn't alone. Flanking it, two PaK-38 50mm anti-tank guns unlimbered from concealed revetments, their crews cranking frantically. The first round from the nearer PaK struck the KV-1's road wheel, the impact jarring like a thunderclap, bending the suspension arm but not halting the advance. Morozov cursed, fighting the controls as the tank listed, sparks flying from the damaged track. "Return fire! Traverse to the PaK!" Kolomiets bellowed, grabbing the override. The turret swung ponderously, the weight making it feel like turning a mountain. Kuznetsov rammed an AP round home, the breech clanging shut. Ivanov fired, the shell punching through the gun's shield at point-blank range, the PaK-38 erupting in a fireball that engulfed its operators. The second gun fired wildly, its round glancing off the turret's 75mm mantlet, with a screech of tortured metal, but the KV-1 pressed on, crushing the pillbox under its tracks. The structure crumpled like cardboard, logs snapping, the ground shuddering as the tank rolled over it, burying the wreckage in a plume of dust. Petrovich's men mopped up the survivors, 7 Germans scrambling from a rear exit, cut down by bayonets and submachine gun bursts. The air reeked of pulverized earth and cordite. The fourth position reduced to rubble, but momentum carried them deeper, the valley constricting into a ravine where shadows pooled like blood. The fifth and sixth positions intertwined, a chain of foxholes linked by trenches, manned by a platoon of panzer grenadiers with Panzerfausts. Those crude rocket launchers, prototypes, rushed to the front, and supported by a single Panzer III ISF. H, its 50mm KWK-38 probing from a hull-down position behind a rock outcrop. Mortar fire from 50mm Granatwerfer tubes began falling, 8cm shells bursting in airbursts that showered shrapnel like iron rain. One fragment sliced through Petrovich's sleeve, drawing blood, but he pressed on, his platoon lobbing F1 grenades into the trenches. "Grenadiers closing! Watch the flanks!" he yelled, as a Faust warhead streaked past the KV-1 sponson, detonating against a birch and sending wooden shards pattering on the armor. Inside, the crew felt the urgency like a vice. Sidorov's radio spat warnings. "Enemy infantry with anti-tank weapons! Evasive!" Morozov zigzagged the tank as best he could, the damaged wheels slowing them to a crawl, mud sucking at the tracks. Kolomiets called targets in rapid succession. Panzer III first, AP. The F-34 thundered, the round slamming into the German tank's side at 400 meters, penetrating the 30mm plating and igniting the fuel tanks. The Panzer III brewed up spectacularly, its escape hatches blowing off as the crew perished in the inferno. With the tank silenced, the coaxial DT machine guns swept the trenches, tracers arcing into the foxholes, silencing the Panzerfausts before they could reload. Kuznetsov transitioned to HE rounds, blasting the trench line in overlapping bursts. Explosions chained along the ravine, hurling bodies and equipment skyward, the ground fracturing under the barrage. The KV-1 advanced methodically, its weight collapsing the weakened earth, burying alive the remnants who sought cover below. Petrovich emerged from the smoke, his face blackened, counting his men, down 2, but the positions cracked. 5 and 6 down. Push on, he gasped, signaling the tank forward. Yet the cost mounted. A hidden 75mm PaK-40, the Wehrmacht's newer punch, revealed itself from a camouflaged pit, its first shot hammering the KV-1's rear armor, buckling a plate and jamming the idler wheel. The tank shuddered to a halt, smoke wisping from the engine compartment. Morozov pounded the dash. "She's overheating! Transmission's slipping!" Alarms blared inside, red lights flashing. Kolomiets assessed, 7 positions crushed so far, but the valley's end loomed with heavier defenses. Rumors of a full battery of 105mm howitzers and fresh panzers from Höpner's reserves. Ivanov swiveled to face the Piquet, firing on the move despite the limp. The shell struck true, obliterating the gun and its crew in a cataclysmic blast. As the KV-1 limped onward, dragging its wounded flank, the afternoon sun dipped toward the horizon, casting the ravine in bloody light. Petrovich's platoon reformed, binding wounds with strips from fallen foes, while distant thunder heralded more Stukas. The outcast tank, battered and unbowed, had carved a bloody path, but the heart of the German line awaited, 11 positions to claim, and the day was far from over. With fuel gauges dropping and the engine coughing, Kolomiets wondered if steel alone could stem the tide, or if this defiance would be their pyre. The KV-1 dragged its wounded track through the ravine's deepening shadows. The engine's V2 diesel coughing like a man with punctured lungs, belching black smoke that trailed behind like a funeral banner. June 22nd, 1941, late afternoon now, and the Rasina Valley near Ryazan had transformed into a labyrinth of death, the sun slanting low to paint the scarred earth in hues of crimson and gold. You can feel the heat seeping through the hull plates, the acrid bite of overheating bearings mixing with the coppery scent of blood from Corporal Dmitry Ivanov's bandaged arm, where shrapnel had kissed him earlier. Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets gripped the commander's periscope, his eyes bloodshot from hours of unblinking vigilance, scanning the constricted path ahead. The Piquet-40 they'd just silenced lay twisted in its pit, a mangled testament to the 8th position claimed, but the tank's idler wheels spun uselessly now, forcing Private Alexei Morozov to nurse the throttles with delicate fury. "She's limping, Comrade Colonel," he muttered, sweat carving rivulets through the grime on his face. "One more hard turn, and we bog for good." Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov, his massive shoulders heaving, slotted another high-explosive shell into the F-34's breech, the metallic clank echoing in the cramped turret like a heartbeat. "Loaded!" he grunted, his Ukrainian accent thick with exhaustion. Private Nikolai Sidorov twisted the radio knobs, the 71 TK-3 set crackling with garbled reports from the crumbling front. Soviet reserves pinned down by Luftwaffe strikes, the 3rd Mechanized Corps fracturing under Panzergruppe 4's relentless push. Outside, Private Ivan Petrovich rallied his depleted platoon, their faces gaunt masks of determination, PPSH-41 drums rattling as they advanced in loose formation. Down to 12 men from 20, they moved like ghosts through the smoke, stepping over the twisted remnants of German foxholes. Helmets askew, bodies sprawled in unnatural poses, the stench of voided bowels rising with the dust. The 9th position revealed itself abruptly, a camouflaged battery of 3 50mm Pak 38 guns, emplaced in a terraced embankment along the ravine's eastern wall. Their crews, veterans from the French campaign, by their faded Iron Cross ribbons, frantically traversing to meet the intruder. Mortar spotters nearby adjusted their 81mm Granatwerfer tubes, lobbing rounds that burst in the air above the KV-1, shrapnel pattering against the turret roof like demonic hail. One fragment punched through a vision port, drawing a yelp from Sidorov as it grazed his shoulder. "Incoming! Evade!" Kolomiets barked, slamming the override lever. Morozov yanked the steering bars, the tank veering sluggishly left, its damaged suspension groaning as it ploughed into a shallow ditch. The first Pak round struck the glacis with a thunderous crack, the 50mm projectile flattening against the 75mm sloped armor in a spray of molten lead, the kinetic shock vibrating through the crew's bones like an earthquake. You imagine the terror in that instant, the world compressing to the whine of incoming fire, the way your pulse hammers in sync with the engine's faltering rhythm. Ivanov, fighting through the pain, swiveled the turret with raw muscle, the hydraulics sluggish from the heat. Targeting lead pack, range 150. His shot boomed out, the HE round detonating inside the gun's trail, ripping the weapon apart in a chain of explosions that claimed the crew and silenced its sisters momentarily. Kuznetsov followed with the coaxial DT, the machine gun's 62-meter rounds stitching across the embankment, tracers igniting ammunition crates in fiery pops. The second pack fired back, its shell caroming off the KV-1 side sponson, denting the 70mm plating and shearing a return roller. Sparks flew inside, igniting a flare of oil from a ruptured line. Morozov stamped it out with his boot, cursing the flames that licked at his ankles. Petrovich's platoon exploited the breach, charging up the slope under covering fire. "For the motherland!" he roared, his voice cracking as he hosed a pack crew with his PPS, the submachine gun's 71-round drum, emptying in a deafening stutter. 2 Germans fell, clutching throats, but a third lobbed a stick grenade that exploded at Petrovich's feet, hurling him backward in a tangle of limbs and dirt. His sergeant dragged him to cover, applying a tourniquet to a leg wound that bled freely, the copper tang sharp in the air. The third pack, desperate, fired point-blank as the KV-1 closed, the round penetrating a weak spot in the lower hull, near the final drive. The impact bucked the tank, alarms wailing as fuel lines ruptured. But the armor held the crew intact. Kolomiets seized the gun controls again, his shot vaporizing the gun in a cataclysmic blast, the 9th position crumbling under the behemoth's advance. The KV-1 rolled over the wreckage, tracks grinding the barrels into scrap, mud oozing up through the floor grates. Deeper into the ravine, the 10th position loomed, a hybrid fortress of entrenched infantry and a pair of Sonkef Z-251 half-tracks, their 20mm Flak 30 autocannons mounted for anti-tank work, supported by a squad of engineers wielding flame projectors. The Germans had wired the approach with telemines, their telltale prods visible in the fading light, but the KV-1's weight detonated them prematurely, geysers of earth erupting harmlessly beneath the tracks. Flame jets streaked out, blackening the hull's paint in oily smears, the heat warping a periscope lens. "Flame team! Machine guns!" Kolomiets commanded. Kuznetsov triggered the hull DT, the bursts cutting down the projector's operator's mid-spurt, while Ivanov targeted the half-tracks. The F-34 spoke twice, shells punching through the thinly armored vehicles, turning them into infernos that lit the ravine like bonfires. Crews bailed out, only to be met by Petrovich's men, bayonets flashing in the firelight, close quarters screams echoing off the walls. But the tank paid dearly. A half-track's parting shot raked the turret ring, jamming the traverse halfway, forcing Ivanov to manhandle it manually. Smoke thickened inside, the engine temperature gauge redlining, Morozov coaxing it forward with whispered pleas. Sidorov broadcasted their plight. Heavy 1 to command, positions 9 and 10 reduced but critical damage, fuel low, mobility impaired. 11th strongpoint ahead, request immediate extraction. Static answered, the lines choked with the symphony of defeat. Petrovich, limping on his wounded leg, climbed aboard the KV-1's rear deck, pounding the hatch. "Colonel, it's a full company up there, 88s, Panzers, the works. We can't take it alone." Kolomiets emerged briefly, the wind whipping his greatcoat, his face etched with the lines of a man who'd gambled everything on this outcast machine. 10 positions crushed, a trail of wreckage marking their defiance against the Blitzkrieg's tide. But the 11th, the heart of the German anchor, barred the valley's exit, artillery tubes glinting in the dusk. Stukas wheeled overhead once more, their shadows promising hell, as fresh panzer rumbles echoed from the north. The KV-1 idled, a battered colossus on the brink, its crew's resolve the only fuel left. In that fragile pause, with the sun dipping below the ridges and the air cooling to carry whispers of night, Kolomiets weighed the final charge, redemption or ruin, for the tank, the men, and the fragile line holding back the Reich. The breaking dawn. The KV-1 teetered on the ravine's lip, its idler wheel a mangled ruin, dragging a furrow of sparks through the cooling earth, as dusk bled into the Racina Valley like spilled ink. June 22nd, 1941, and the final light of day filtered through the canopy of shattered pines, casting elongated shadows that danced with the flicker of distant fires. You can hear the labored rasp of the V2 engine, each revolution a defiant gasp, the air inside thick with the oily reek of leaking fuel and the sharp sting of adrenaline-soaked sweat. Lieutenant Colonel Vladimir Kolomiets hauled himself back into the turret, sealing the hatch with a finality that echoed his resolve, his greatcoat snagging on the battered frame. Private Ivan Petrovich clung to the rear deck, his wounded leg throbbing with every jolt, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage as he peered into the gloom. "11's the linchpin, Colonel," he shouted through the intercom hatch, his voice raw. "Break it, and their whole flank crumbles. Scouts say it's the command post for Hupner's vanguard." Inside, the crew braced for the endgame. Sergeant Yuri Kuznetsov chambered the last armor-piercing round from the depleted rack, his hands trembling not from fear, but fatigue. The BR-350A's tungsten core glinting faintly in the red glow of emergency lights. Corporal Dmitry Ivanov, arms slung across his chest, manned the jammed turret ring manually, muscles straining against the frozen gears. Private Alexei Morozov gripped the controls like a lifeline, the fuel gauge hovering on empty, the transmissions slipping with every shift. Private Nikolai Sidorov keyed the radio one last time, the 71 TK3's tubes whining in protest. "Heavy 1 to all units, final push on 11th position. If we fall, avenge us." Static swallowed the plea, but faint acknowledgements crackled back. Soviet artillery batteries repositioning, T-34s rallying from the rear. The 11th position sprawled across the ravine's mouth, a fortified redoubt anchoring the German line, ringed by sandbagged 88mm Flak 36 guns in elevated pits, their long barrels silhouetted against the fading sky like accusing fingers. Flanking them, 2 Panzer IV AUSF. E-tanks hulked in revetments, their 75mm KWK-37 cannons probing the approach, while a company of Panzer Grenadiers, over 60 men in spiked helmets, manned interlocking trenches laced with S-mines and MG-42 buzzsaws. At the center, a command bunker of reinforced timber and concrete housed the battery's fire director, signal flares arcing upward to guide inbound Stukas that circled like vultures, their Jericho sirens a psychological whip. Mortar crews fed 120 Tutim Nebelwerfer rockets into multiple launch tubes, the screaming memes ready to saturate the kill zone. Intelligence fragments pieced together in Kolomiets' mind painted it clear. This was the nerve center for the 6th Panzer's push on Ryazan, a bulwark that, if unbroken, would encircle the 3rd Mechanized Corps by dawn. "Full ahead, ram the center," Kolomiets commanded, his voice a steel anchor in the chaos. Morozov floored the throttles, the KV-1 surging forward in a lurching charge, its 45 tons barreling down the slope like an avalanche. Tracks chewed through a minefield, detonating buried charges in muffled booms that hurled clods of dirt but barely slowed the behemoth, the broad plates distributing the blasts. Petrovich leaped off, his platoon fanning out to draw fire, PPSH-41s stuttering into the trenches. Bullets hosed back, an MG-42's 200-round-per-minute roar shredding the air, one burst catching a Soviet soldier in the chest and spinning him into the underbrush with a gurgling cry. Petrovich dove behind a felled log, lobbing an F-1 grenade that silenced a machine gun post, the explosion's flash illuminating twisted faces in the German lines. The first 88 Mitamut spoke as the KV-1 closed to 300 meters, the round slamming into the frontal glacis with a cataclysmic clang that buckled the plate inward, flames licking through a hairline crack. The crew jolted, Ivanov's sight blurring from the shock. But the armor, Khotin's unyielding design, held, the projectile's energy dissipating in a spray of sparks. "Gunner! The lead flak! AP!" Kolomiets yelled, overriding the traverse himself. Kuznetsov had no shells left for the main gun. Desperation shifted to the DT machine guns. Coaxial and hull sweep the cruise. The twin 62mm streams erupted, tracers lancing into the pit, cutting down the 88mm loaders mid-motion, their bodies crumpling over the breach. The gun fired blindly once more, the shell whistling harmlessly into the ridge before falling silent. A Panzer IV traversed to meet them, its KWK barking a high explosive round that struck the turret mantlet, the impact wrenching the jammed ring free in a shower of bolts. Ivanov seized the moment, the F-34, now empty, recoiling dry as he dry-fired in frustration. "No," Kuznetsov improvised, grabbing a discarded signal flare from the radio kit and jamming it into the barrel as a makeshift rammer, but it was futile. The KV-1 was out of main gun ammo, reduced to a battering ram. Morozov drove straight at the Panzer, the collision a world-ending crash, 45 tons versus 25. The Soviet giant's momentum crumpling the German tank's front like tin, tracks overriding the turret in a screech of rending steel. The Panzer IV's fuel ignited, enveloping both in a brief inferno, but the KV-1 pushed through, flames guttering against its blackened armor, the crew shielding their faces from the blistering heat. Petrovich's men stormed the flanks, bayonets clashing in the smoke, screams mingling with the Nebelwerfer's howl as rockets streaked overhead, detonating in fiery clusters that lit the night. One barrage caught the platoon, hurling Petrovich into a crater, his vision swimming as shrapnel peppered the earth. From the bunker, a German major, face pale under his peaked cap, bellowed orders, directing the 2nd Panzer IV to enfilade the KV-1 from the side. Its shells hammered the sponson, one penetrating the thinner 40mm plating near the engine, igniting a fire that Morozov battled with a fire extinguisher, white foam mixing with blood from his burns. Sidorov slumped over the radio, a fragment in his neck, but his final transmission pierced the ether. 11th falling, glory to the Rodina. Kolomiets kicked open the escape hatch, emerging with a Tokarev pistol in hand, the cool night air a shock after the inferno. "Abandon if you must, but we take it." The KV-1, engine screaming in death throes, ploughed into the bunker, its weight collapsing the roof in a roar of timber and dust. The structure imploded, crushing the command post, flares and maps spilling into the open as the major and his staff perished beneath the rubble. The remaining 80-meter crew broke, fleeing into the dark, while the 2nd Panzer reversed in panic, only to be swarmed by Petrovich's survivors, satchel charges lobbed into its engine decks. The tank erupted, a beacon illuminating the route as German infantry surrendered in waves, hands raised against the Soviet tide. As midnight cloaked the valley, the KV-1 ground to a halt atop the ruins, its hull a scarred monument, engine silent at last. Kolomiets slid down the side, helping Ivanov and Kuznetsov out, their wounds grave but spirits unbroken. Petrovich limped forward, counting the living. 8 from his platoon, the crew intact save for Morozov's burns and Sidorov's fading pulse. Reinforcements arrived at dawn's first grey, T-34s rumbling up, Soviet artillery thundering in support. The 6th Panzer's advance shattered. The dismissed giant had crushed all 11 positions, buying precious hours that blunted Barbarossa's spearhead at Reisnen, its legend whispered in debriefs from Moscow to the front. In the quiet aftermath, as medics tended the wounded and engineers assessed the wreck, Kolomiets lit a cigarette, exhaling into the wind that carried away the smoke of battle. The KV-1, too heavy for doctrine, had become the anvil that bent the blitzkrieg, a testament to Soviet steel and human fire, forged in the crucible of one endless day. The war ground on, but here, defiance had carved its mark, unyielding as the motherland itself.